Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Each episode, I'll read stories written by me, Derrick Heisey. So settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. The Feeds.
I started watching other people's cameras because I was bored. I stumbled onto the site completely by accident. I think I might have been looking for cameras to start a new hobby, and the algorithm thought I wanted to look through cameras, I guess. I wonder what my life would be like if it had taken me to the right place. As soon as the site loaded, I was greeted by a wall of thumbnails, each detailing a random scene. Some of the thumbnails were totally dark, others were pointed at random objects, but a lot of them, most of them, stared into a person's face at an unflattering angle. I thought it was weird, but, I was bored. So I clicked. I was curious, and it was an enticing proposition, something new to watch. And what would you watch? Why, people, of course. Consequence-free voyeurism. Just hop on and watch. I couldn't believe it wasn't staged. It was too amazing. I'd click on a person's thumbnail, drop in on their cameras, webcams, or cell phones, and glimpse into their real lives. I thought the amount of tech needed was too much. It had to be staged. But the longer I spent on the site, the more I saw, the more I watched, the more it became obvious it couldn't be staged. I once watched a middle-aged woman lay in bed for hours. Reflected in her glasses were brightly colored candy puzzle pieces dropping, swapping, and exploding into sprinkles. The form of her husband, knocked out cold, unmoving, lay in the periphery of the phone's glow. Who's gonna pay people to do that at 3 a.m? The site was real. The people were real, and they were totally clueless. I can't explain what attracted me to it. At first, I thought it was a sex thing, some forbidden door I'd stumbled upon. Whenever people talk about voyeurs, that's what it's always about, right? They're peeping through open windows on girls in sorority houses or big city apartment complexes, jacking off into tissues and Dixie cups. And that's what it was for me at first, too. I'd scroll through the weird screen grabs of the different people looking for the prettiest girl, and I'd drop in hoping she was lonely. It almost never happened. I still couldn't stop watching. It's hard to place what I liked about it, or why I couldn't stop. Maybe it was the power trip. When I think about it, that's the most likely reason. I liked knowing they showed me their private moments. It was kind of beautiful. Kind of pure. I didn't ask them for anything, they didn't ask me for anything. We simply existed together, sharing the same space with honesty. It became my only hobby. It became the reason I got up every morning, the reason I went to work, so I could come home, pay my internet bill, pay the site subscription, and watch. Watching consumed me. I could have done it forever. Until it came. It waited a long time. I didn't realize it was there until 3 months in, and then it came in as a faint blur, like a smudge in the back, always off on the side. I saw it in every one of the feeds I watched. All of them. Every single one. The blur smeared the left edge of every feed. It was elusive, like an eye floaty. The moment I turned my attention to it, the blur vanished. It was really annoying, especially because I thought it was a problem with my monitor. There was no way that every single camera on the face of the planet had an issue. So I worked a few overtime weeks to save up for one of those massive, curved, Ultra HD monitors with a light-changing soundbar underneath. That didn't solve it, though. If anything, it made it worse. I'd see the blur in sharp, vivid color, defying any attempts to be made more defined, and it seemed to seep into the surrounding image. One day, I left the cameras running while I had a screen capture program on. I wanted to record it for later, you know. I woke up to a wounded screen vomiting sparks out onto the desk. The black smudge had blown a hole in the LED. I thought I'd lose my shit. Fortunately, I'd only just recently thrown out the old monitor, so it was still in the dumpster. I needed it. If I didn't have a monitor, I couldn't watch the feeds. If I couldn't watch the feeds, I'd lose my mind. I called out that day. The prospect of losing the feeds until I got a replacement monitor made me so upset that I couldn't breathe for a while. The edges of my vision got blurry and fuzzy, and I had to stop. I wanted the whole day with my feeds in case I lost them again. Especially since the recording I'd made was completely corrupted. It made me wonder if there was some kind of safeguard against the recording, but with the screen caps on the thumbnails, that couldn't be possible. Anyway, that day, I curled up in my big, zero-gravity chair, watching the feeds. It was like being in the womb. So secure, so safe. I didn't have to worry about anything or anybody. All I had to do was enjoy this special time with my favorite people. I found some atmospheric ambient music on YouTube and floated away. The worst was when they'd put their phones in their pockets. When all I saw was darkness, it was almost guaranteed to be there for a while. Sometimes they do it right in the middle of when they were doing something interesting, and that was the worst. But more often than not, watching paid off. I once saw a woman in a kitchen whose phone must have been propped up so she could read the recipe. She chopped onions with fierce concentration, tying her brow into knots, the very tip of a bright pink tongue peeking from between her lips. Then she moved on to the carrots. Finally, the mushrooms, scooping all the vegetables into a big metal bowl. She scraped the knife's face against the inner lip of the bowl to remove a few straggling mushroom slices, and then she paused. Her exposed forearm stretched before the camera as it steadied the bowl against the blade. She must have had an amazing phone, because I could almost make out blue veins running down milky white skin from the heel of her palm to her elbow. The pause stretched longer. Something was going to happen. My saliva thickened into hot gelatin, and my heart galloped against my ribcage. She raised the blade, brought it to her skin, and drew it slowly across. Red tears wept over pale flesh and dripped into the food. Distressed but unceasing, the woman's arms and body seemed transfixed, her face awash in agony, and that's when I saw it. The blur. It took shape now, almost like a person. It was monstrous, towering above the woman as it stood in the far corner of the kitchen behind her, a silhouette drawn in shadow, smoke, or static. I couldn't tell which. It defied any precise definition. But it wasn't a person. It was interference. It had to be. I'd never seen anything like it before, but that was the only reasonable explanation. The woman must have something magnetic or a different electronic or something interfering with the camera's signal. The blur coalesced in the background like a well of shadows and approached her. I couldn't focus on it. The moment I looked at it directly, it vanished. I had to focus on the woman and watch it in my peripherals as it reached out. And then the phone lost its balance, landing screen down on the countertop. I rocketed out of my chair and howled. This was the best thing I'd ever seen, and now I wasn't gonna know the ending? Unacceptable. I had to know. I immediately took to the internet to find out who the woman was. It was hard, especially because the feed was essentially cut. I checked it every few minutes, but it remained the faintly lit black screen of a blocked camera. I mustered up what details I could from my memory, and I dug. But I couldn't find her. I didn't know enough. I didn't have enough clues. I couldn't figure out where she lived based only on the interior of her kitchen. Her feed never came back. It was gone without a trace in a few hours, as if the people on the site erased her. I became obsessed. I looked for lateral job transitions so I could work from home and spend more time on my feeds. I scraped by for another monitor and set them up side by side, one so I could work and another so I could monitor the feeds. All my money was going to pay for the site, so I didn't have much to spare, but I absolutely had to monitor the feeds. Now, I was looking for the blur. I still enjoyed the feeds, don't get me wrong, but now I was convinced that there was a conspiracy with the blur. Maybe some of the feeds were faked and staged, and they threw them in there for intrigue. But if that was the case, it was working. This Easter egg was exciting, whatever it was. Was there some kind of meta story underlying the whole thing? Was this some kind of messed up ARG made to scare people like me? If so, it failed. It only made me more ruthless. I trawled Reddit and other forums, looking for answers, seeking someone else who'd seen the blur on the feeds, but I came up with nothing. Was I the only one who'd experienced the blur? Weeks went by. I practically lived on my computer. My goldfish died because I forgot to feed it. I was so focused on my screens. It wasn't until the water had turned cloudy and stank that I noticed. Part of me is amazed I could keep my job, but it's probably because I knew if I didn't bring in any money, I couldn't watch the feeds. And if I couldn't watch the feeds, I couldn't find the blur. I don't think I really would have quit searching, but part of me was almost ready to. I was barely sleeping, sustaining myself with short naps, living on microwaved burritos and Diet Coke I had delivered to my door. I hadn't gotten sight of the thing again. More likely, a bigger part of me was ready to accept I'd imagined the blur. Maybe I'd spent so much time on the feeds that I'd fallen asleep and had a weird dream. I don't know. One night, I was so weary and had a big project due, so I was about to turn in for a night of real sleep. It could have been the first full night of sleep I'd had in over a month if I hadn't refreshed the page by accident. It was a side shot, probably taken from a nightstand, of a man on all fours in bed. He glared into the pillow, extended arms flexing with effort and strain. Veins bulged in his forehead. He struggled to keep something down. And that's when I saw the hand wrap around his wrist. When I leaned forward and squinted, I saw a nose peeking out behind the edge of the pillow. The man on top pushed harder, leaning with all his weight into the body beneath him. The hand appeared to pull at his wrist, trying to pry him off. Then it materialized. It was a gradual collection of darkness, the same process as in the woman's kitchen. It coalesced, mote by mote, gathering the darkness together like collecting wool. I fumbled for my notepad and scribbled down as many details as I could. I took screenshots of the apartment bedroom, hoping I could use them later as clues. I watched in anticipatory awe as a pair of legs futilely kicked the air at the man's back. My heart pounded as I wondered why the blur was with them. It soon became apparent. When the hand stopped resisting, when it fell limp to the side what felt like hours later, it became obvious what the shadow wanted. It wanted lives. I had no doubt the woman from the kitchen had killed herself. That's why it had stalked her. It was ready to prey on the energy of those who died. My suspicion was confirmed after the murderer grabbed a pack of cigarettes and a lighter from the bed table. He left the room, passing right in front of the blur. The moment he left, it advanced, reaching out for the corpse, putting its shadowy hands on it. White, wispy tendrils rose out of the corpse as the blur popped in and out of focus. Its edges would sharpen and soften over and over again. The tendrils wheedled into the blur, entering it in degrees up along its arms, across its chest, shoulders, and neck. And at last, when every wispy tendril had vanished into the blur's static mass, its edges sharpened permanently. I thought about the woman in the kitchen. The blur hunted her, stalking its prey, same as it was here. When the murderer returned, the blur was still there. The man gazed at the corpse with a puckered, morose expression, then shook his head. The blur came close behind him, extending its round, arm-like appendages on either side of its head. From the man's ears, the white tendrils snaked out. He stood for a while, staring at what he'd done while the blur fed and became more defined. The man withdrew a gun from the same bedside table he'd gotten the smokes and put it in his mouth. The wall behind him was painted red, and he collapsed to the floor. Shocked, I couldn't move. I stared, frozen, mouth agape at the screen. I needed to see what happened next. I needed to know how the story ended. The blur stood before the red smear, facing the camera, and raised a hand. A hand. Defined, articulated with 5 fingers. It waved, and then its whole being flickered out of existence like bad reception. The feed went black hours later. The site took down the page. The next time I saw it, I think it saw me too. It came easier this time. Rather than spending weeks waiting and hunting, I only spent a few days. Part of me felt like I was figuring out the patterns, the energy of the people, the way they'd look, and could stake them out by then. But a deeper part of me couldn't shake the idea that it was planned. I didn't know how or why. I know social media companies will manipulate what you see and make you buy stuff. Maybe the site owners were manipulating it to make me see the feeds they wanted me to, guiding me to the places they wanted me to find. Were they leading me to the blur? It was on the front page. First thumbnail. I knew it almost before I fully registered the image. A man with a desperate look in his eyes. Heavy bags, sallow skin, patchy hair. He looked like the poster child for struggle. Like life had put him through the ringer and won. The kind of guy at the end of his rope. He's next, I thought. There was no way the blur wouldn't want to feed on him. I still didn't know what it was feeding on, but whatever he had, that's what it wanted. I bet to the blur, that guy looked like prime rib. Despair. Maybe that's what it was eating. Maybe it fed on people's despair. The blur loomed in the distance behind the guy while he mindlessly scrolled on his phone for hours. He took periodic slugs of Jack Daniels straight from the bottle. I got the sense he'd been drinking for a while before I'd shown up, and he finished the bottle while I watched, throwing the empty carcass across the room. It didn't take long before he started crying. I think he was already doing it before, but quietly. In that way, you're not even sure you're crying. When you're so full of emotion, your eyes just sort of leak it all out, and before you know it, your face is wet. I'd have it happen, usually when I talk to my parents on the phone. That discrepancy, between who they were and who they are now. Sometimes it was too much. Anyway, I recognized this guy's heart. I recognized the shadows cast by cloudy skies. I knew his despair. The blur got close. There wasn't a smooth transition or a clean appearance. It wasn't like it materialized or the camera cut off briefly. One moment, the space behind the sad, drunk guy was empty, and the next, it was blurred. As the man wept, the blur raised its arms, framing his face at the ears. Like fungal mycelium, the white tendrils spread out again, leaking out of his skin and wriggling into the blur's defined hands, its now narrow wrists and into its solidifying forearms. The more it took, the more defined it got, and the harder he wept, until finally he wound down and stopped. He seemed to fall asleep, but I knew what had happened. He drank a lot. He was passed out, and he wasn't waking up. It would show up as alcohol poisoning. But the blur had killed him. Souls. I felt the world drop out from beneath me and realized everything I knew was wrong. Death wasn't a natural state of being. It wasn't something that had to happen. Death was a parasite, an opportunistic bottom feeder devouring the life force of those at the end of their rope. Death was the blur. As it drained the drunk man's energy, features formed on its head like a child scrawling on the sidewalk with a big piece of chalk. 2 scribbled dots for eyes and a long, narrow mouth. The crude face wasn't static either. It was in constant movement, almost as if it were being created and recreated over and over without being erased. When the blur stopped pulling the white threads out of the drunk man, it settled its attention onto me and then smiled. I wish I could say I didn't know how I knew. I wish I could say it was paranoia, that I was on the knife's edge of my nerves because of what I'd witnessed. But I knew it had focused onto me because I felt it. Goosebumps turned my skin inside out. My palms grew sweaty and my feet went cold. A shudder racked my whole spinal column. And then it beckoned. It reached out with its hand to beckon with a finger. It was less of a request and more of a taunt. It knew it was being watched. It knew I was watching it. I checked my body to ensure I didn't have any white tendrils coming off of me, patting it, almost like I was looking for something in my pockets. And then the feed cut. The website crashed, and when I reloaded the site, the sad, sallow man was removed from the site entirely. But a new feed appeared. This one didn't have a person's face on the thumbnail yet. It was fresh, within the last hour or two, and no one in the community had managed to screen cap their face yet. It was only a random grab of their environment. But I recognized the space. I recognized the couch and the coffee table. I knew the carpet. I treaded flat at the thresholds of the doors. It was my apartment. Under normal circumstances, I might have appreciated the irony and welcomed it, if only briefly, but now that the blur had beckoned to me, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I was marked. I've started doing everything I can to do better, to be better. I've been eating only plant-based food. I've been running and doing yoga every day. I even started meditating. I'm desperate. It's death, right? I'm not misunderstanding something, am I? It's coming to take my life. So if I'm healthy, it can't take me. If I can settle my rattling nerves and I can find peace, it can't make me take my own. I can be safe. I can be saved, right? I swear I can see it in the corner of my eyes. I swear when I turn around, I can see pieces of it dematerialize like I just missed an escape. Sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I can hear the faint crackle of static. Sometimes, during late nights when sweat beads my foreheads and my thoughts turn into a whirlpool of despair, I swear I see little white tendrils rise up from my cheekbones. I'm always worried that tonight's gonna be the night. I'm not ready to go. Please don't let it take me. Will you watch over me? Will you keep me safe?
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member. Don't forget to leave a rating. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you'd like to go the extra mile, you can join my Patreon for $3 a month and you can cancel at any time. Or you can buy my book on Amazon. I've put links to both in the description. I'd love to connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads. Just look for Nightmares and Grief and you'll find me. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.